Good afternoon. In just a few minutes, we will begin the event, Populism and the European Union, Past, Present, and Future of the 28th edition of Cátedra Europa, organized by ValEUs Research and Education Network on Contestations to EU Foreign Policies, co-funded by the European Union. We kindly ask those present to take their seats and silence their mobile phones. We also invite you to use the hashtag Cátedra Europa to share your comments on social media and to consult the academic and cultural program of Cátedra Europa through the university's websites www.university.edu.co. We continue with the commemoration of the 20 years of Cátedra Europa at Universidad del Norte with Sweden and Denmark as guest countries of honor. Cátedra Europa is a program that promotes the analysis of the main challenges of our region, viewed from an international perspective. We would like to highlight the participation over these 27 years of more than 3,000 guest speakers and over 120,000 attenders. We will now begin our program with the welcome remarks by Ms. Mariangela Rueda Fiorentino, Head of the Department of Political Science and International Relations of Uninorte and researcher of the ValEUs Project.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todos, a todas, bienvenidos, bienvenidas a este evento titulado Populismo en Europa, pasado, presente y futuro. En el día de hoy tenemos el honor de contar con la presentación de la profesora Angela Bourne, quien nos acompaña desde la Universidad de Roskilde en Dinamarca. Como acaban ustedes de escuchar, este evento hace parte de las Lecture Series en el marco del proyecto de investigación ValEUs, cofinanciado por la Unión Europea. El proyecto ValEUs es una red de investigadores en educación y análisis, investigaciones sobre la política exterior de la Unión Europea, en el cual hacemos parte más de 20 universidades en 17 países del mundo. La Universidad del Norte está presente desde los departamentos de Ciencia Política y Relaciones Internacionales y el Departamento de Derecho, con un equipo de profesoras que hacemos parte del proyecto de investigación, y asimismo colaboramos con varias universidades en la región y también en Europa y en otras partes del mundo. Como parte de este proyecto, una serie de conferencias, de eventos académicos, de escuelas de verano se vienen realizando desde el año pasado. Y en este año, en esta oportunidad, en Cátedra Europa, tenemos el honor de contar con uno de sus eventos más significativos, que es justamente las Lecture Series. Aquí tenemos entonces en el día de hoy a la profesora Angela Bourne, que nos acompaña desde Dinamarca y a quien agradecemos enormemente su presencia en la Universidad del Norte. La doctora Angela Bourne is a professor at the Institute of Social Sciences and Business at Roskilde University. Research and teaching expertise falls within the fields of comparative European politics and European Union studies. She has a bachelor's degree from Queensland University and a master from Lancaster University and a PhD from University of Bristol. Dr. Bourne has published 2 monographs, 3 edited books, and journal articles in high-ranking peer-reviewed articles, including European Journal of Political Research, Journal of Common Market Studies, Democratization, International Journal of Public Opinion Research, Terrorism, and Political Violence. Other research interests include multi-level governance in Europe, Europeanization of social movements, minority nationalist politics in Spain, responses to terrorism. She teaches courses on globalization and populism, approaches to populism, European Union institutions and governance, war, peace, and security, among others. She is a member of the ValEUs Project, co-funded by the European Union. Welcome, Dr. Bourne.
Okay, thank you for your warm words of welcome. This is the first time I've been in Colombia, The first time I've been in Latin America. And I've had some wonderful impressions, not least coming to a lecture theatre completely full of people interested in European politics. What I would like to do in the short amount of time I have with you is to say something about populism and the European Union. This is a topic which over the last 15, 20 years, we've come to talk about a lot more. And this is because populist parties in Europe are becoming much more powerful than they were 20, 30 years ago. They are not just fringe opposition parties. Populist parties run governments and they participate as coalition partners and support parties in many governments in the European Union. We also talk about populism and the European Union a lot more because populist parties, and in different ways, populist parties of the left and the right, are generally Eurosceptic. They have a critical position in terms of the European Union, of varying degrees and varying different types, but they tend to put themselves in opposition to the European Union. And the example of Brexit, the European Union leaving, the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, is probably the pinnacle of this relationship between populism and the European Union. I think another reason why it's more important to talk about populism and the European Union these days is because within the institutions, the power of certain populist parties means that populist agendas also shape European Union agendas, perhaps more than they did in the past. And this includes key policy areas like immigration, more recently, the EU's efforts to develop policies to deal with climate change, the European Green Deal, and perhaps fundamentally in terms of security policy and how the European Union can respond to the very real war in its neighborhood, the war between Russia and Ukraine. And finally, one of the important reasons why we talk about populism and the European Union much more these days is because the impact of certain, not all, but certain populist parties has started to challenge the self-definition of the European Union as a community of liberal democratic states. I do not hold the view that populism is necessarily a problem for liberal democracy. But in the European Union, a number of populist parties in charge of running governments in their countries have undermined liberal democratic institutions in their countries. And at the same time, by extension, they've undermined liberal democracy in the European Union. I'd like to do a couple of things in the half an hour or so I have to speak to you. To begin with, I want to say a little bit of something about how I understand populism and what it means in the European context. I'd also like to highlight 4 key moments that illustrate some of the points that I've just said in a little more depth. But if I'm going to make one argument throughout this lecture, perhaps in a rather fragmented way, it's the idea that populist parties are more powerful and they impact the agenda of the European Union in all sorts of different ways. But I'd also like to make the point that the fact that we're talking about the European Union, the fact that we're talking about an organization of a high level of interdependence between member states, but also societies, means that we can expect the very fact of being a member of the European Union can influence the behavior of populist parties in particular within the member states as well. And this is not just the kinds of appeals they make. It's not just part of the explanation for why populist parties have become much more successful in Europe. It's also important to take into account the fact of membership to understand the constraints and opportunities shaping populist politics within member states as well. And this, and I wonder whether you will tell me that this is true, this may be something which sets apart populism in Europe, in the context in the European Union, from populism in other regions of the world, including your own. Okay. Let's see. Let me start with this question of what is populism and how important is it in Europe? There are many ways of defining populism, but perhaps one of the most cited definitions of populism is this one by Cas Bourne. He defines populism as a thin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups. It's a vision of society as divided between the people, the pure people, versus the elite, the evil elite. It's also an ideology or way of thinking about society and the world, which argues that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale, or the general will of the people. This particular way of thinking about populism describes it as a moralistic discourse, a way of pitching the people as, or the will of the people as intrinsically good, and yet the will of the elite is seen to be intrinsically evil. It's also often described in this tradition as a Manichaean logic, a way of seeing the world in which there are friends and there are enemies, a very polarizing way to think about politics, which makes compromise between different political positions more differently. As I mentioned a few moments ago, I do not think that populism is necessarily a threat to liberal democracy. Where the elites are bad, appeals to the people can be emancipatory. They can be a way to unite different groups of people to build a better society. But what we have seen in many cases is that populism can be a way to turn liberal democracies into illiberal democracies. Some people talk about it as a kind of democratic extremism, which devalues checks and balances on the will of the majority, or which devalues political pluralism and the importance of opposition, not just of parties, but also of civil society groups as well. And I think the final thing we need to think about when we're talking about populism is this idea of thin-centered ideology. So if we're talking about ideology, we're talking about ideas, we're talking about discourses, we're talking about visions of the world and how politics and societies work. The idea that populism is a thin-centered ideology means that it doesn't provide in itself a comprehensive worldview in the way that socialism or conservatism or maybe nationalism provide a big picture, a big script for understanding how the world works. And that is why we often talk about populism as being of the left and of the right. And that's because it attaches itself to all sorts of different grander political ideologies. So now on the question of how significant or how important are populist parties in Europe, and what is the trend? So I have two graphs here. The first one is from a data set called the Populist, and this is a data set which reflects expert opinions about which parties are in fact populist parties or not, or which are far right and far left parties. So what this shows is far left and far right political parties, And the ones in the middle are populist parties of the left and the right, and what we call valence populists in white in the middle. So what is of most interest to us is the light blue, the white, and the light red lines on this first graph. And basically, it shows us two interesting things about populism in Europe. The first is that populism in Europe is principally right-wing populism. The light blue is mostly what populism is about. And indeed, most of what I'm talking about today is about right-wing populism. There are left-wing populist parties in Europe, some of which became very important, particularly after the financial crisis. But when we're talking about populism in Europe, we're mostly talking about right-wing populist parties and some of the harder to classify parties in the white. And I think the other thing that we need to notice from this particular graph is that we've seen quite a growth in voter support for populist parties from the 1990s until today. So in the 1990s, populist parties, left, right, and valence, on average in Europe, won about 8-9% of the vote. But today, it's closer to 30% of the vote. So a lot more people in Europe in free and fair elections are choosing to vote for populist parties. That's a very important observation about the topic we're talking about today. On the other side of this slide, you can see some information about how powerful radical right populist parties are in different European countries. This shows which countries have populist parties in government, and this can be populist parties leading government or participating in government as coalition partners or as support parties from outside of the government. And so you can see here, the darker the color, the more powerful. And we have, at the moment, this is a snapshot, we have 6 countries in the European Union that have populist parties in government. And the lighter colors, the pinks, show in May 2024, countries where populist parties of the right were in first or second position in the polls. This was just before the European Parliament elections were held. And so what this shows us is that it's not just 1 or 2 countries where populist parties are important. It's pretty much everywhere. It's pretty much everywhere. And if you look at third positionings, we'd probably have pretty much all of the gray countries on this particular map. Fourth position, we'd have everyone covered in terms of countries where populist parties are important in terms of their position in government and also their popularity with voters. So we might ask, what's going on? What explains this increasing success, particularly of right-wing populist parties in Europe? And I think there's a number of explanations. Some are contextual, they depend on the country. For example, how skillful political entrepreneurs may be in one country or another. But many of the explanations for the rise of populism have something to do with European integration itself. And I think we can point to 3 important explanations that have something to do with the European Union. One is increasing discontent with the development of the European project among citizens, among voters, particularly since the 1990s. From about the 1990s onwards, this was the time the European Union agreed the Maastricht Treaty. They substantially increased the powers of the European Union. They introduced a single currency. Not long after, they agreed to wide-scale enlargement of the membership of the European Union to encompass post-communist countries, among other countries. So as the EU became more powerful, many populist parties mobilized and won many voters with the argument that the EU had become too powerful. It was limiting the ability of individual states to decide on their own destiny. Another argument that helps us understand the success of populist parties is economic discontent. This is a major trigger for support for populist parties in Europe and other parts of the world as well. A particular or a major turning point for the European populist parties was the financial crisis that began in 2008 and had a strong European flavor in a European sovereign debt crisis in 2010. Populist parties were able to capitalize on very substantial discontent among European citizens in response to austerity policies introduced in many countries, often at the behest of the European Union, in order to deal with the consequences of the financial crisis. And this is an important explanation for also why populist parties became more powerful in the European Union. A third explanation focuses on the politicization of immigration in the European Union. And here, a key event was a migration crisis in 2015, 2016, where very large numbers of migrants and refugees from the Middle East and Africa came to Europe. Populist parties built on already existing anxieties about the impact of immigration for the preservation of cultural values and practices in the EU. And in the context of this migration crisis, they very successfully securitized immigration as something that was promoted by the member states and supported by the European Union. So in all these different ways, the success of populist parties in Europe also have something to do with the European Union, although not entirely the European Union. So I would like to now turn to 4 moments that help us understand a little bit better this changing relationship between populism and the European Union. The first moment was from 2000. In this year, the Freedom Party of Austria was incorporated into a coalition government with the center-right party, People's Party in Austria. In response, at the time, 14 other European Union member states agreed on diplomatic sanctions against Austria because of the nature of this government. And in particular, they were worried that the xenophobic, nationalistic, and sometimes way too sympathetic statements in support of Hitler policies, Nazi policies during the Second World War, were a threat to EU values, a threat to democracy, tolerance, and human rights. Now, this particular response did not last very long. The EU organized a group of experts, and the group of experts agreed that actually the existence of this government and the practices of this government did not undermine democratic standards in Austria. And so pretty quickly, 7 months later, the sanctions against Austria were dropped. But we learned a couple of lessons from this experience, which have influenced the way in which the EU has responded to the growing importance of populist parties. I think one of the interesting things about this episode is that it's extremely unlikely to happen again. And that is because, as we've seen, it is now normal for populist parties to lead and be part of governments in Europe. At the time, it was seen as a shock, but now it's normal. At the same time, it was expected, or perhaps hoped, that EU sanctions would do something internally to politics in Austria, that it might turn people against this government, turn Austrian citizens against the government. But it didn't happen. Instead, it backfired, and many citizens in Austria were in fact critical of the European Union. And this is a lesson which has stayed with the European Union, that EU intervention into the domestic politics of a member state on political issues like this can backfire and increase Euroscepticism. A second, perhaps more important moment was 2010. This was the time when Viktor Orban became Prime Minister in Hungary for a second time. His party, Fidesz, also controlled a majority in the Hungarian parliament. And they used their majority to pretty quickly undermine liberal democratic institutions in Hungary. Hungary was for a long time an example of successful democratization after the end of communism. But now the extent of democratic backsliding in Hungary has reached the extent where we no longer call Hungary a democracy anymore. It is often referred to as an illiberal democracy or an electoral autocracy. It wasn't just an isolated event. Several other European countries, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, elected radical right populist parties to power who followed the same path set by Orban's government. And this included governments in Poland, different points in Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Romania, Slovenia as well. This was very important. This was a change in the characteristics of the European Union in some very fundamental ways. It meant, for example, that the European Union developed a whole new policy area dedicated to democratic defense of EU values and democratic institutions, designed to try to provide incentives against democratic backsliding. And this new policy area effectively included a series of instruments. It included using some existing instruments more, including court cases, cases in the Court of Justice of the European Union. It included triggering Article 7 of the Treaty of the European Union, which is designed to deal with risks to EU values, essentially liberal democracy, human rights, tolerance, and pluralism. This has been triggered against Hungary and Poland, although dropped now against Poland. The importance of this particular procedure was that nobody ever really thought it would be used. It used to be called a nuclear option. And indeed, it includes the possibility, not used, to introduce voting sanctions against a member state in the Council. In 2020, EU member states in the middle of COVID crisis agreed another new policy instrument, which effectively allowed them to introduce financial sanctions to hold back EU budget receipts in a country that could not guarantee the rule of law. This was used as leverage, particularly countries in Central and Eastern Europe, which do receive more from the EU budget than they pay in, although it has only been used against Hungary, who essentially has its contributions from the EU budget frozen. Now, you might think that this development of a policy of democratic defense might have some effects on democratic backsliding, but it does not seem to have had an effect, particularly on the governments of these member states. In Hungary, democratic backsliding did not slow down. In several other countries, there was also limited effect on the policies of the member states because it became possible to again turn around European intervention in a member state and bolster Eurosceptical arguments to rally around the flag against the European Union. What is perhaps more interesting is the way in which EU interventions of this kind can change internal domestic politics and can change the arguments of opposition members who could point to the possibility of voting sanctions or financial sanctions, or at some point in the future, the possibility of being forced out of the European Union to criticize and show the dangers of the actions of their government. Let's turn now to the third moment. And this was a real case of a populist movement forcing a country out of the European Union. And what I'm talking about here, of course, is Brexit. Brexit, the result of a referendum held in 2016, where the people of the United Kingdom voted by a very small majority, under 52%, for their country to leave the European Union. The United Kingdom had long had a very difficult or complex relationship with the European Union. Opinion polls showed that many people were in fact dissatisfied with being a member of the European Union. It was one of the lowest levels of support among all of EU member states for really a very long time. The UK also negotiated opt-outs from key moments of integration, such as an opt-out from joining the single currency, or an opt-out from the Schengen area, the border-free area of the European Union. But a referendum was previously held in the 1970s, and 2/3 of people voting in that referendum agreed that it was best for the United Kingdom to stay. And so for a generation, this question of whether or not the United Kingdom should be in the European Union was settled. That was until the United Kingdom Independence Party, a populist party with leaving the European Union as one of its key policy programs, started to rise in the polls. For a while, it was successful in European Parliament elections, but by around 2015, this party was becoming more successful in national elections. And in the hope that the United Kingdom might be able to settle the question of the UK's status in the EU for another generation, the Conservative government decided to hold a referendum. They thought they would win it, but they didn't. And in the end, the United Kingdom left the European Union in 2020. This was a very damaging moment for the European Union. It was probably more damaging for the United Kingdom in terms of economic relationships and security relationships, among other things. But it could have been a lot worse. It really could have been a lot worse. It was a friendly divorce, and the European Union remained pretty much united throughout the whole process. There was also speculation just after the 2016 referendum that there may be a contagion effect, that other particularly radical right populist parties might also want to hold their own referendum. But this didn't happen. And this was because, in fact, the whole Brexit process was not a success. It became very apparent that it was a very risky process to leave the European Union. And indeed, what we've tended to see, particularly with the big populist parties, a softening, a moderation of Eurosceptical positions in the acknowledgement that the level of integration between European states is such that leaving is a big deal and can be counterproductive. I will very quickly say something about the fourth moment in this evolving relationship between the European Union and populism. And I think this fourth moment, closer today, is the result of the European Parliament election in 2024. Here we saw an increase in support for far right, and in this category we're mostly talking about radical right populist parties, to about 26% of members of the European Parliament. And this has been a gradual increase in support. Now, this doesn't mean that they can influence the agenda on their own. And indeed, they're quite divided. They coexist in 3 different parliamentary groups. But what is important is that we've seen a change in behavior by the other parties. The far-right parties used to be ostracized, systematically kept out of coalitions for legislation and positions of power in the European Parliament. But this Parliament, we're seeing much more willingness. It's still fairly rare, but an increased willingness on the part of the right, the centre-right, to collaborate with radical right populist parties. And sometimes this has implications for symbolic issues, such as a condemnation of Venezuela after its recent elections. But it is also starting to have an impact on specific policy areas. And one area to watch here is, in fact, climate change. The right across the spectrum has, on a number of occasions, voted together in a very important change of patterns to weaken the EU's very important climate change agenda. And I'm just going to finish with two small points. I can see my colleagues are wanting me to round up. We cannot predict the future, but there are some things to watch out for. And I think there's two things to watch out for in the next year or so. One is in France. The National Rally, perhaps led by Marine Le Pen, who is, depending on court cases, or her colleague Jordan Bardella, may win the presidency of France. So this would put a Eurosceptic party in power in one of the core states of the European Union, and it could have all sorts of unpredictable implications for the future direction of the European Union. I could say more about this, but I won't. Another thing to watch out for is a consolidation of a right-wing populist bloc of Visegrad states in Central and Eastern Europe. This is an unstable and shifting coalition, but the importance of this coalition is that it has the ability to undermine the unity of the European Union in a number of important areas, especially in relation to the war in Ukraine. Several parties of this coalition, not all, have a neutralist position regarding the war in Ukraine or a veiled pro-Russian position, and also in the European Union's relations with Donald Trump, which are very difficult at the moment. And so really to conclude, my argument is that whether you like it or not, for good or bad, depending on your political position, populism will remain an important part of the dynamics of European integration for the short to medium term. And this is where I can leave things.
We thank Dr. Bourne for her detailed presentation. We will open a space for the audience to make your comments or your questions. Are there any questions for Dr. Bourne? Okay, we will make two questions. So
Hi, hello. First of all, I am so excited to just be here and kind of pick out your brain. It was a great presentation. I wanted to ask you about Brexit. It was actually the point 3 that you asked, that you put in the presentation. It was because of the the referendum that the conservative group lost, and that made the Brexit happen. But I wanted to know, how did the European Union took it at first, and how at the time it is well they're taking things, and how, if it's still kind of weird or different that this main country is not there. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really good question. I think Brexit was completely unexpected. I did not expect it. Most people in the United Kingdom did not expect it. And when it happened, if you're skeptical, it was a wonderful day. But if you were even mildly in favor of the European Union, it was a terrible day when you found this out. Other European countries were also very sad, except if you were Eurosceptic. And many Eurosceptic parties actually thought this was a wonderful example of just what is possible. Nobody really thought very much about the possibility of a country leaving the European Union. And then over many, many years, it took a long time to negotiate the terms of the agreement. Actually, relations were very cordial. Negotiations were fairly polite. Of course, countries dealt with their own interests. The European Union and the United Kingdom sought to pursue their own preferences and interests. But the European Union maintained unity in their negotiations. They fought from a position of strength because the European Union united was much stronger than the United Kingdom, who was actually leaving. Everybody accepts now. At the beginning, it wasn't sure what kind of Brexit it would be. Some thought it might be a soft Brexit to do with maintaining a customs union or some kind of relationship like the European Economic Area. But in the end, the Conservative government went for a hard Brexit, that they were going to leave the European Union entirely. I think people accept for a generation. That's what's the situation is. But there's always talk. I think also one of the candidates for being a leader of the United Kingdom Labour Party just yesterday said, maybe in my generation we might rejoin the EU again. And the current government is trying to reset relations with the European Union, because in all sorts of ways, it's very clear that the United Kingdom is more isolated now, particularly in relation to tariff negotiations with Trump, or the war in the neighborhood, the war with Ukraine. So I think it's very mixed feelings that people have about Brexit. If you're a Eurosceptic, it's great. But even then, it's very difficult to say that Brexit was a success and an example to follow. And that most European states would have trouble even dealing with the costs that the United Kingdom dealt with, a big country that wasn't even part of the Eurozone. It's probably much harder for smaller states, part of the Eurozone, and very dependent on other European states for their security at a moment like this, to seriously contemplate leaving the European Union.
So my question is, what do you think social democratic parties should do to overturn the table, or what are the theories or explanations about the failure of social democracy and the welfare states within the European Union?
That's a very good question, and in a way, a difficult question to answer, because in some ways, social democratic parties have taken on key populist themes. One example is migration policy. Almost everywhere in the European Union, whether you have a center-right or a social democratic government, the trend has been to more restrictive immigration policies. And that really shows the influence of radical right populist parties, both in countries and also at the level of the European Union as well. So in a sense, social democrats have not always been fighting or opposing populist parties entirely. They've co-opted many of their policies, although it's different in different countries. I hope that answers. I mean, maybe one point, and that's perhaps relevant for the conference today, is that welfare states may make a difference when it comes to the kind of populist parties that are successful. I mean, in Scandinavia, there's been a long tradition of populist parties. Radical right populist parties have been very successful, but they've been less able to campaign on issues of massive differences in living standards. In many ways, the existence of a welfare state evens out some of the differences that lead to populist parties that want to make very big changes in constitutional arrangements. And indeed, populist parties in Scandinavia tend to be pretty much in favor of maintaining the constitutional status quo, even if they may undermine commitments to equality of all citizens based on issues of race. So yes, I hope that answers your question.
Well, first of all, thank you for your great speech. It was really interesting. So, well, taking into account that in the case of the European Union, like in always in history, every type of pathogen in terms of political aspects they have, it has always had an impact on international environment in terms of politics and diplomacy, for example, here in Latin America. Do you think that it's possible that this type of populist behaviors in terms not just only of national politics in the case of example of UK, but also in international politics, it could have like a certain impact or a reflection, for example, here in Latin America? Do you think it's maybe possible that, I don't know, in the near future, Colombia, for example, maybe could make this type of action that, for example, UK took with the European Union?
Mm-hmm. Another really good question. I've mostly been talking about internal aspects of European Union politics, but there are clear international dimensions to the changing flavor of European politics. I think we're seeing at the moment, for example, trouble in terms of leadership on climate change issues. For a long time, the EU wanted to think of itself as a leader in terms of international climate change negotiations. And it's struggling at the moment to cobble together a set of promises for reductions in CO2 levels in the context of international negotiations. I mean, climate change is one issue where the center-right and the radical right are really weakening the EU's ability to develop a strong leadership position. It's not just them, but that's part of the recipe. So there are certainly international implications. I think it's also relevant in terms of international security situation at the moment and relationships with Trump, for better or worse. Many radical right parties, not all, have tried to build good, solid relationships with the United States. Sometimes that works. Italy's Meloni, for example, has aligned with the mainstream of the EU on many issues, including the war with Ukraine, and tried to be a kind of broker with Trump. And she is the leader of a party in Italy, radical right populist party, but part of the mainstream in terms of the big issues in the European Union. But on the other hand, people like Viktor Orban, who also consider themselves on the side of Trump, has fallen foul in some ways because of a close relationship or trying to establish a close relationship with Putin. And so this means that when Trump changes his mind on something like oil sanctions, then countries like Romania, which have had this friendly relationship with Russia, countries like Hungary, which have had a friendly relationship with Russia, can very easily fall foul to the ups and downs, the the changes in Trump's policy. So there's very big implications in terms of the ability of the European Union to act a united way in international politics. And I'm sorry, but I can't say too much about the relationships with Colombia. Maybe you have some views on that point.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. With this, we conclude the event, Populism and European Union, Past, Present, and Future. We invite you to join our scholarship campaign, Together We Are More, and contribute to the education of talented young people from the Caribbean region. Likewise, we encourage you to continue following the program of Cátedra Europa by visiting the university's website and to share your impressions using the hashtag Cátedra Europa. We invite you to follow the ValEUs Project social media channels, and we wish you all a very pleasant day. Thank you.